Don't you just love it when government proposes a new program to help you? And we've had so many of them. And in the long run, it always seems as though they don't help us. They injure the economy, the family, any number of things. Now the President of the United States is proposing MyRA, as sort of a government IRA program so that you can save money toward your retirement. Well, it seemed to me we had another president that offered that same solution back in the 1930s. It was called Social Security. And that was what it was supposed to be, that you were going to put money aside for your retirement. Then all of a sudden the Supreme Court ruled that, wait a minute, this is not an investment program. You have no entitlement to this money. Actually, it is a tax. Oh yes, there's a contract from the government that will pay you something in the end when you retire at a specific age, etc. But even then, they cheat on it because they don't give you the true percentage of increase each year that's based on inflation. So one of the reasons, just one of the reasons, that the government fudges on what the real inflation rate is so they don't have to hike Social Security. So instead now they're going to come out, Social Security doesn't work obviously, they've got a new program, MyRA. If the President of the United States gets up in promotion of this and says, you can keep your IRA, just like he said you can keep your doctor, well, maybe you better worry a little bit. And the other thing is, if he says you can keep your banker, you've really got to worry. At any rate, this is just another one of these schemes that it ultimately will lead to the confiscation of the wealth of the American people. For instance, there was a Forbes magazine article that was posted on the International Monetary Fund laying the groundwork for global wealth confiscation. And let me just read you the first paragraph of this. It says, the International Monetary Fund quickly dropped a bomb in its October Fiscal Monitor report titled Taxing Times. The report paints a dire picture for advanced economies with high debts that fail to aggressively, quote, mobilize domestic revenue, unquote. It goes on to build a case for drastic measures and recommends a series of escalating income and consumption tax increases culminating in the direct confiscation of assets. Can anybody spell Cyprus? You recall what they did there, where they just one day just arbitrarily confiscated the certain percentage of everybody's wealth that was in the banks. However, it was deposited in the banks. Well, certain people had prior notice, like Russians and those, they got their money out of town before the government confiscated it. Well, now they're talking about confiscating these accounts all over the world, not just Cyprus. They call it bail-in. And they have all these fancy words for simply confiscating your wealth. And so I wouldn't want, for instance, to invest in MyRA, controlled by the government of the United States, because I would probably find out that the Supreme Court would make the same kind of decision that it did with Social Security, and they might even do it without any decision from the Supreme Court and just confiscate it one way or the other, partially or entirely. Can't trust these people. It's the way it is. Jefferson said, bind their hands down from mischief with the chains of the Constitution. And speaking of that, that's what we should be doing today in regards to another economic problem, and that's the budget. Instead, what we hear is we've got to change the Constitution. The John Birch Society loves the Constitution so much that it doesn't want to amend it. It wants to preserve it. These other people who claim to love the Constitution so much, they want to amend it. They want to hold a conference of the states, a constitutional convention, an Article 5 convention, any name that you wish to put on it. One of the main thrusts towards this end is the BBA, or Balanced Budget Amendment. Now, I have not seen very many balanced budget amendments that don't have a commonality to them. Obviously, they would. But let's talk about that for a moment. Have you ever heard anyone advocating a conference of the states talking about the Federal Reserve? That we need to rein in the Federal Reserve? Question: how can you have a balanced budget amendment that will actually balance out the economy without talking about the Federal Reserve? You can have a balanced budget. In fact, we had a balanced budget 1 year under President Clinton. And yet the debt went up. And the debt went up because of the obligations we already had on the books. You can have a balanced budget. You can have a balanced budget amendment. But the obligations we already have will unbalance the amount of money coming in versus the amount of money going out. So the Federal Reserve can bankrupt the United States, balanced budget or no balanced budget, with the policies of simply running the printing presses, stripping the wealth away from the American people through inflation by secretly giving money to Europe or wherever. The partial audit that was done a few years ago revealed the fact that the Fed was sending money to Europe to bail out those countries. That's not on the budget, and yet it comes out of our pockets. The mantra today is we've got to do something now. Well, almost every one of these balanced budget amendments delay it into the future. They're talking about a constitutional convention maybe by 2016. Then on top of that, the balanced budget proposals delay implementation of a balanced budget and the amendment anywhere from 4 to 5 years after it's ratified. Does that make sense? If the problem is now with the hockey stick of indebtedness and leading us towards bankruptcy? Have you ever heard any of these individuals who advocate a balanced budget amendment talking about getting rid of unconstitutional agencies of the federal government, such as the EPA, the Department of Education, and other multi-billion-dollar debt? Not debt, but the expenditures. And so these agencies that are unconstitutional expend billions of dollars a year. But that's not in the balanced budget to get rid of these agencies. Why not? They talk about a national emergency. It'll be a balanced budget unless we go to war or have a national emergency, but they don't say what a national emergency is. And a president can call a national emergency at any time. We have a crisis. It can be a crisis of war. It can be a crisis of the economy. So if he calls a national emergency, balanced budget's gone. So these are some of the things that you have to take into account if you really mean business. We can get rid of these agencies. We can adhere to the Constitution of the United States and balance the budget. Why don't we? Why don't we hear from these people that they have to adhere to the Constitution as it's written now? That somehow we have to change the Constitution. It's inadequate. It's weak. It's flawed. It's not flawed. What's flawed is the politicians who implement it, because they're not. They're not adhering to it. And the people must force their politicians to adhere to the Constitution, or they won't adhere to any new amendments either. And finally, you cannot balance the budget and have a balanced budget amendment or change the Constitution in any way, for better or worse, without taking into account the treaties, pacts, agreements, and partnerships, the foreign entanglements, in other words, that our government is involved in. You just can't do it. And so you have to look at that aspect of it too. They don't talk about that. In fact, in some cases, they're for all these foreign entanglements and for amending the Constitution through a constitutional convention. When you roll all this together, and these things seem rather obvious to us, then why aren't these people that want this convention talking about these things? Sometimes I think that there's a little bit more motivation that we don't know about. And I'd sure like to be able to pick their brains, as they say, to find out what it is. Until next week, we'll see you then.